I'm very happy to be here. I'm Deborah Nord. I teach English literature and have always been sort of privileged to be on the margins of the historical profession in one way or another. So it's an honor for me to be here. This is our third roundtable. It is called Paradigm Challenges and Generational Change, Part 2. All of the panelists, you can see that with each succeeding roundtable, the panelists get younger. So today we have, not necessarily the chairs of the panels, but the panelists. So today we have people who have gotten their degrees since 2000, or in 2000 and after. And we'll be thinking about paradigm shifts that actually we've already touched on a little bit. But things like the imperial turn, the material turn, masculinity studies, sexuality studies. 3 of the people on this panel are working on men or masculinity. The imperial turn is important, very important to one of our panelists. There are a couple of people here who have interests in policy, so there are a couple of new things that are going to emerge on this panel. And then, of course, as we have been tending to do, we want to speculate a little bit about what impact this will have on the field of women and gender studies, on its subject and also its methodology, which is something that I think Judy Walkowitz asked about at the end of the day yesterday. So each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes. I'm going to introduce everybody at once at the beginning, alphabetically, and then they will speak alphabetically. So first we have Ariane Chernock, who is an assistant professor of history at Boston University. She has her PhD from Berkeley. Her advisor was Tom Lacour, who obviously has an important role as mentor today. Her prize-winning first book is called Men and the Making of Modern British Feminism, came out in 2010. And it's about the contributions that men made to the question of women's rights in late 18th century Britain. Her new book, the book she's working on now, is a cultural and intellectual history of British encounters with female sovereigns at home and abroad in the long 19th century. And its tentative title is The Queen and I, The Right to Reign and the Rights of Women in Victorian Britain. Next is Lucy Delap, who's currently a fellow at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, and a member of the history faculty at Cambridge, but she's about to change jobs and become a reader in 20th century British history at King's College, London, where she'll be director of the research unit, History and Policy. Her PhD is from King's College, Cambridge, in history, 2002, and her first book, also a prize-winning book, is called The Feminist Avant-Garde, Transatlantic Encounters of the Early 20th Century. Her second book is called Knowing Their Place, Domestic Service in 20th Century Britain, and she was a consultant in this context for the 2012 BBC series Servants, The True Story of Below Stairs. So you can ask her questions about Downton Abbey after the panel. She's now working on masculinities, gender activism, and religion in 20th century Britain with an edited collection to be published on this in 2013. Then we have April Galway, since I'm sticking with the alphabetical, who's a research fellow in oral history at the Institute for Advanced Studies, University of Warwick. Her PhD is from Warwick in 2012, so she's our junior scholar. But she also has a master's in comparative social policy from Oxford, 2006. She works on single motherhood, which I've learned is called lone motherhood in Britain. And she's working on this in relation to welfare and policy. Her current project at Warwick is called Voices of the University, Memories of Warwick, 1965 and 2015, which is going to be an archival collection of some 200 interviews with people who have been at or worked at Warwick. She's also preparing for publication a book called A History of the Single Mother After 1945, which is the first history of single or lone motherhood in post-war Britain. And then we have Durba Ghosh, who's an associate professor of history at Cornell. Her PhD is also from Berkeley, 2000. She works on South Asia, gender, British Empire. Her first book is Sex and the Family in Colonial India, The Making of Empire, which covers the 18th and 19th centuries. She's currently working on popular and radical political movements in early mid-20th century India with emphasis on the role and the meaning of political violence, and it has the tentative title of Gentlemanly Terrorists, or at least gentlemanly terrorists are the people she's interested in. So, without further ado, Ariane.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to start by thanking Susan, Eileen, and Chris for bringing us all together today. This is, as I keep saying, and others have said as well, it's a gift. I'd also like to say it's a real honor to represent the youth as someone pushing 40. This is an exciting moment for me, and it makes me really grateful to be part of the historical profession where, you know, I can represent youth at least for another 10 years, I think. So it's very exciting. Okay. There were certain kinds of women's history that I considered clearly outmoded when I began graduate school at Berkeley in the late 1990s. Histories promising acts of recovery, histories that seemed too overtly feminist or empiricist, histories of royalty and elites more generally, family history, and biography. The future of my field, I felt, lay with gender, representation, the dangerous supplement, performativity, the public sphere, masculinity studies, the new cultural history, the new historicism, and the new imperial history. Myself, circa 1998 or 1999 then, would be surprised and perhaps dismayed to hear the comments that I've prepared for this panel, which I've structured around the theme of the shock of the old. The phrase comes from David Edgerton. It's not my own phrase. He uses this idea in his book to unsettle the way in which we think about the history of technology in the 20th century. Employing a use-based as opposed to innovation-centric framework for understanding technological change, Edgerton gamely demonstrates that much of what we deem old continues to shape our world. Now, the analogy is something of a crude one. I'm not trying to suggest any equivalency in my remarks this morning between 1970s academic feminism and a bicycle, okay? But I embrace Edgerton's larger point. In determining how to narrate the history of women and gender, it is the new that continually lures us in. The promise of novelty, dynamism, and change offered by the new historicism, the new imperial history, the new cultural history, the new political history, and now, of course, also the new transnationalism. I still haven't quite figured out how new transnationalism is really that different from old international history, but we can talk about that more later. The reality, however, as I've gradually come to see it, is that these newer approaches never fully supplant the old ones, and that the old continues apace, shaping our scholarship in profound ways, though often receiving little credit. And so in my comments this morning, you're going to see echoes of Bonnie's talk yesterday, and I think there are a lot of overlaps in the kind of comments we prepared for this meeting. Those early practitioners of women's history, and of British women's history specifically, still have a lot to teach us. In many ways, these comments then are about my own lessons in humility. They're about my own decision to break with the tradition of breaking with the past. Now, when I'm talking about early practitioners here, in part I'm thinking of those scholars who came to the fore during the 1970s, many in this room today, so often unabashedly political in their stance towards women's history, committed to feminist activisms and institutional affiliations as an integral part of their professional identity. In hindsight, I am struck by how complacent my own approach to women's and gender history really was in the formative stages of my career, even as I benefited from the intellectual and institutional networks that had been forged by those who came before me. In graduate school, I often felt that what was at stake in my work was how well I played the game, how well I played with ideas, with theories, with language. I really was quite isolated from social movements. And this is really a marked contrast to some of those who spoke yesterday. And I think this play has to be seen in its broader context. These years when I was completing my coursework at Berkeley, 1997 to 2000, were the years of the dot-com bubble, which was really prevalent in the Bay Area. These were the years of the Clinton-Blair partnership. European history ended in 1989, or at least that was one of the possible scenarios that we suggested to our undergraduate students in History 5, Western Civilization. So that's just to provide you with some context. Well, 9/11 and the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan changed this tone, lending urgency to my work and the work of my peers. And I don't think my experience was unique in this regard at all. I arrived in London to begin my dissertation research the second week of September 2001. And I remember sitting in the British Library, beginning to research my dissertation on male feminists of the 18th century, and being struck by resonances between my work and the contemporary scene in ways that really had entirely eluded me before as I had prepared my proposal for research. Just to give you an example, in a book called The Empire of the Nares, or The Rights of Women, a utopian romance published in 1811 by a man named James Henry Lawrence, Lawrence makes an argument for invading Kandahar on the grounds that the women in Afghanistan, this is 1811, okay, that the women in Afghanistan are being deprived of their rights, as he puts it. For these reasons, the Nares, who are an Indian group who serve for Lawrence as kind of proxies for British ambitions and aspirations, must rush into Afghanistan. And as they enter these harems, they proclaim, quote, "We, the Knights of the Phoenix, the sworn defenders of the rights of women, proclaim you free and under the protection of our order." So this is really 18th century style imperialist feminism. 1811. To put it differently, the charged political landscape in the early 21st century disabused me of any notion that there might be an end to history, or that the big questions in women's and gender history had already been resolved, beliefs that I had entertained just a few years earlier. Writing about men's engagement with women's rights in Enlightenment Britain was no longer just historical play, a creative way of inserting myself into academic debates about masculinity studies and the diverse origins of feminism. Rather, the arguments that I was mapping mattered. They had played a role in determining how our world is made, both locally and globally, for better and worse. Bottom line, this post-9/11 moment was one of the first times I felt that what I was writing was engaged history, history with a sense of purpose. Over the past 10 years, this new sense of engagement has galvanized me and others as well. The exponential, even if fraught, growth in the field of human rights history and the history of the institutions that forged and facilitated the spread of human rights agendas more generally speaks, I think, to this same impulse. And of course, Britain has a central role in these narratives and has allowed a lot of scholars in our field to engage in these kinds of debates. The 1970s moment, though, has offered more than a model of engaged scholarship. The recuperative dimension of this enterprise has also proven incredibly seductive in ways that I could not have predicted in the late 1990s, when I really, again, looked kind of down on empiricism. If polled as a graduate student, I probably would have insisted that most of the voices that were hidden from history had already been uncovered, or at least the voices of those worth paying attention to. By that point, the female chartist, the female preacher, the female Owenite had developed a fairly sophisticated voice, and it was often difficult to see how I might contribute to that conversation. Yet so much of the recent work in British women's and gender history that I admire, and I'm thinking here especially of Mrs. Woolf and the Servants, or Charles Dickens and the House of Fallen Women, are precisely in this historical vein. Detailed, nuanced, sympathetic portraits of socially disadvantaged women whose lives and labors had previously been lost from view. What is more, my own dissertation-turned-book, Men and the Making of Modern British Feminism, ended up being largely recuperative in its methods and aims, far more recuperative than I had initially imagined. As I've come to appreciate through my own time spent in various regional archives in the UK, much is still hidden from history, in part because of the ideological assumptions we continue to bring to bear on our subjects of study, in part because of the ways in which the nation state has continued, despite the frequent critiques, to be privileged in our training, in part because of the failures and limits of our sources, though digitization has dramatically transformed the kinds of women's and gender history that are possible to write. And I hope perhaps in our Q&A today we can talk a little bit about how the digital humanities are changing our field, since this didn't come up yesterday. Recovery at its best, I now realize even more than before, is never just recovery. As some of the trailblazers in the 70s took such great pains to point out, one can't recuperate without also disrupting prevailing narratives and paradigms. And this work of disrupting, both empirically as well as theoretically, remains as necessary as ever, even if what we're disrupting is a moving target. So I'm increasingly realizing that this process of recovery is a continual process. When I talk about the shock of the old, though, I'm not just considering the 1970s, the foundational moment for this conference. I'm also considering the even earlier history of women stretching back to the 18th and 19th centuries. And this is where I really begin to echo Bonnie. Much as I've come to appreciate, one might even say rediscover, what Jill Liddington and Jill Norris, amongst others, were doing in the 70s. So I've also come, especially in the past few years through my work on 19th century queenship, to embrace many of the perspectives and practices of those historians of women writing even before women's history became a discipline with all of its professional apparatus. And I'm thinking here of Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland, who Bonnie mentioned yesterday, Anna Jameson, Marianne Everett Green, Hannah Lawrence, and many others as well, including some notable men who engaged in women's history in the 19th century. These early practitioners of what we would describe as women's history often chose female worthies as their subjects. That is, female monarchs, warriors, saints, and savants, distinguished by their rank, talent, piety, or otherwise noteworthy contributions. These early historians selected such atypical subjects for a range of reasons. There were nationalistic reasons, philosophical reasons, political reasons, and pragmatic reasons as well. We cannot ignore the fact that questions of access to sources and remuneration were hugely determinative in why people chose these subjects. Biography or collective biography were the preferred approaches. Such histories, for understandable reasons, only became more popular following the coronation of Queen Victoria in 1838. So if we were to pinpoint a single moment when British women's history cohered, I would actually push for the late 1830s and 40s rather than the 1970s, since it was this period that witnessed the exponential growth in histories of women, many authored for the first time by female historians. Some of these authors were highly strategic in their approach to historical material. Agnes Strickland, for example, dwelled at length in her Lives of the Queens of England on Elizabeth I's questionable penchant for needlework. The goal was, at least in large part, to placate. But even many of these strategic accounts were surprisingly sophisticated, both in explaining their choice of elite subject matter and in their historical analysis. As the reformer and historian Mary Hayes remarked in her appeal to the men of Great Britain in behalf of women that she wrote in 1798, quote, "Let it not be said that crowned heads are too much out of the common road to be brought forward for examples." When the modern discipline of women's history was forged in the 1970s, of course, many scholars were profoundly embarrassed by these origins. Natalie Zeman Davis dwelled on the limits of the woman-worthy genre, urging her readers to shift their focus from women worthies to a worthier craft. But I don't think I'm alone in revisiting, in my own recent work, some of those very same exceptional subjects that the early historians of women in Britain and elsewhere once tackled. So if you survey what's being published in our field today, it does seem that many scholars are reclaiming what, for lack of a better word, I will call elite material. Look, for example, even at the trajectory of Dorothy Thompson, from Chartism to Queen Victoria. Many of those who are not writing on such subjects are actually studying the history of these elite histories. That itself has become a kind of boom business within women's history. What is more, the biographical or group biographical approach, which dominated early women's historical writing, is also only gaining in popularity amongst scholars, with family or group biographies seeing a particular resurgence in recent years. And I'm thinking here most recently of Emma Rothschild's extremely successful Inner Life of Empires, which is in a way very much gender history. Now, in calling attention to these trends, I'm not suggesting that our field is reverting or that such a reversion would be desirable. Most of those scholars embracing elite subjects or more traditional approaches to writing the history of women and gender do so in ways that are nuanced and sophisticated, mindful of the crucial interventions and debates that historians of women and gender have staged in recent decades, and attentive to broader shifts in the historical field. When I wrote very recently about the relationship between Queen Victoria and Queen Ranavalona of Madagascar, for example, I drew on the insights of the new cultural history, the new imperial history, and the new transnational history to read my subjects. That I even chose to place these subjects in the same frame reflects my indebtedness to this historiography. I also tried to use these elite figures as a means of bringing together a far broader swath of men and women, Malagasy Christians, female missionaries, Foreign Office bureaucrats, Victorian penny novelists and journalists. For these reasons, I am not particularly concerned, as Judith Bennett recently quipped, that given the number of books, articles, and dissertations adopting a biographical approach, women's and gender history today is in danger of tilting too far back toward woman-worthies. Those are Bennett's own words. In fact, I would take a different tack here and suggest that, if anything, we work toward adopting a more flexible and capacious, though still critical, understanding of our discipline's past. That is, that we start paying attention, as much attention to what we can borrow, as well as what we can break free from. And I think for too much of my career, the emphasis was on what I could break free from, not what I could take forward. In short, I'm urging us to be less generational in our thinking. For a discipline and a broader social movement that has organized itself around generations or waves, or even radio waves, such a prospect may have shock value indeed. Thank you.
So I'm really pleased to get the chance to give my paper today, but also to respond to some of the things that we discussed yesterday. There was lots and lots of resonance and moments of overlap for me. And my origins really intellectually are in the history of feminism rather than women's history, which I kind of see as a contiguous field rather than necessarily a subfield. And I couldn't really resist starting out with the thought that came into my mind when Karen finished her panel yesterday with the question, what have we done for the generations that have come afterwards, with my memory of the very first monograph that I read being Her Equivocal Feminists when I started work as a graduate student, and how important that book was for me in saying that the history of feminism was as intellectually credible and significant as any other field. And so that really shaped my own decision to go on and work on Edwardian feminism, and was very important for me. So my background wasn't in a history undergraduate. I studied philosophy and social and political sciences, faculties where, the phrase that Sharon used yesterday, feminism was the lingua franca, really held true for me, and Signs as a journal was a very, very inspirational location. When I got into women's history and the history of feminism, it was partly prompted by somebody giving me a Virago edition of Alexandra Kollontai's Love of Worker Bees. And I was really pleased yesterday that we spent quite a bit of time thinking or just nodding to, acknowledging the significance of publishing and the feminist presses and the women's presses, which I think have been as significant in some ways as the academy in opening up these spaces that we all now inhabit. So when I began my doctoral research, also in the late 1990s, it seemed a very good time to me to be attending to how the history of feminism might fit into the history of ideas or intellectual history. That was where I was sort of starting from. And my interests were centering on questions about the nature of the state in the late 19th and early 20th century, the influence of individualism, the kind of utopian thinking that was developing at that time, the changing fortunes of liberalism, of socialism, all those questions that are kind of the bread and butter of intellectual history in some ways. So for me, bringing those questions into dialogue with women's and gender history seemed a very, very productive intersection. It was helpful, I think, to help intellectual history become less canonical, less elitist, less likely to just look at the ideas of men. And to recognize that ideas are developed and rooted frequently in social movement activism. So, social movements were very much at the heart of how I was thinking about intellectual history. But I think it's good to acknowledge as well the reciprocity there, that in their turn, the kind of methodologies and the ways of doing history that were there in intellectual history have really been fruitful for those thinking about the history of feminism in helping us think contextually, synchronically, sort of moving away, if you like, from what Virginia Woolf talked about as thinking back through our foremothers, which, as we all know, has often lent itself to some quite sort of Whiggish or decontextualized narratives. I think intellectual history has also been pushing, if you like, in the same direction as the history of feminism in helping us to think beyond national borders, ideas never having been respecters of geographical limits. And so I approached my own study of feminism after some time, I have to say, of thinking of it as a British project. I came to think of it as an Anglo-American project, and ended up really foregrounding these Anglo-American conversations that were rooted in periodicals as well as in friendship networks, which were underpinning the kind of the feminist thinking of that period. And since then, like so many of us in the room, I've been working on empire and its mobilities. And certainly it's something for us to acknowledge that we're, if you like, enormously indebted to the imperial turn and the new imperial history and also the non-imperial influence of, say, South Asian history or the Africanists. And less typically, perhaps, I've also worked on the maritime environment, specifically on shipwrecks, which of course take place well beyond the boundaries of nations, typically. So there was a lot of resonance for me with what Catherine Gleadle was talking about yesterday around oceans and waves and so on. Although I also couldn't help remembering the experience of giving a paper on it was on the gender significance of the dreadnought at the National Maritime Museum, where I was clearly regarded by the audience as the kind of the entertainment of the conference before they could get back to discussing the diameters of the guns and the location of the gun deck and so on. And, so it was a very jovial occasion where any mention of the word women or gender prompted gales of laughter in the audience. I think that this tendency for us to think beyond national boundaries in our work has been really helpful to foreground and highlight women's mobility as historical agents. Of course, that's sometimes an unwilling or compromised kind of mobility, just as we might think about women's agency, but also recognized how compromised or partial, as well as strategic, that agency can be. Now, my pathway since that kind of early interest in the transnational history of feminism has ranged through social and cultural history, and most recently, I've been looking at masculinities, which has proved, a very thriving but also very controversial area for historians of women and gender. And I'd always been kind of aware of the almost submerged presence of men in the field of the history of feminism, because the work that I started out doing on the coining of the word feminism in the early 20th century was so clearly indicated that the reason why that word was needed, or one of the reasons why that word was needed, was because the women's movement did not really allow for the participation of men. And there were so many men who were very interested in thinking about the woman question in fairly new ways. And of course, this chimes very much with Ariane's work on men's involvement in 18th and early 19th century feminism. I think men were also a sub-theme in my research on domestic service, where I was very interested in the kind of the problematic selfhood of male servants, who found that the deferential mode expected of servants very much conflicted with sort of normative ideas of masculinities. But so kind of submerged presences that have more recently become a much more active focus of interest of mine, which probably is also related to having had two sons around the time that I turned to working on masculinities. So I've been looking at two very different sites for thinking about masculinities. One is the Church of England Men's Society. You wouldn't really think that they needed a men's society, but nonetheless, across the whole of the 20th century, there was a Church of England Men's Society for Anglican men who felt that they really needed to get together with other men. And they're very interesting. They're kind of provincial men mostly. They're sort of darts-playing, whist-playing men, autodidacts seeking men's fellowship. And second, I've been looking at a very different group of men who also felt that they wanted a homosocial environment. But these are the men who were at the peripheries, or sometimes quite close to the center of the women's liberation movement in the 70s and 80s, men who termed themselves pro-feminist, anti-sexist, or sometimes just feminist. So this turn to masculinities has, for me, been a bit like Ariane was commenting there, a very sort of urgent area of research, in that I think this stuff really speaks to very ongoing concerns, both culturally, socially, and in policy terms, to think about masculinities, to think about the problematic nature of boyhood, young men, and elderly men, in fact, in Britain today. I also think that my interest in Anglican men is suggestive of another turn. I'm a bit reluctant to say that this is a turn, I don't know, but towards greater attentiveness to religion. And I think it's increasingly clear that gender, however we may want to understand that, is structured by spiritual and religious commitments, amongst other things. And religious belief is one of the things that gives gender purchase and makes it operative, if you like, in the lives of historical subjects. Now, I suspect that with some very significant exceptions, some of whom we've been discussing yesterday, earlier generations of historians of women were less motivated to look at religion, perhaps because they believed it to be patriarchally organized, or perhaps because it didn't seem to be a very promising site for sort of radical and subversive ways of being. I think on the one hand, looking at religion is of interest and works well for me, because there has been a turn towards looking at gender conservatism, and particularly at conservative women. And this is sort of a bit like, but slightly different to the things around the turn towards elites that Ariane was talking about. So the kinds of women that I've been interested are the anti-feminists, the pro-imperial women, or just conventionally religious women. But I think on the other hand, it's also clear that research on faith and religion doesn't necessarily have to mean conservatism, and there are all sorts of scholars who have alerted us to the very dissident power of religion. I'm thinking of Joy Dixon here, Sue Morgan. And Joy Dixon's work in particular on theosophy is, I think, very exciting, very welcome, as part of the diversification of the field to look beyond Christianity, and I'm talking about British women's history here, of course, and to look at other faiths. And this is an area where I think there's lots and lots of potential for more work. I think also looking at religious faith is one of the areas where it helps us respond to Michael Roper's really important request that we spend more time as gender historians thinking about the way in which subjectivity and selfhood is constructed at the psychological level as well as socially and culturally. And I think on this question of the interest in the psychological and the spiritual, it's clear to me that this doesn't really work in a kind of generational sense. You know, we can't say that this is something that younger generations have come to and older generations neglected, as Sally's career tells us. And for me, looking at religion has led me to think about masculinities, because I do think it's clear that assumptions that religion is somehow defined by women's faith and femininity have been quite wrong, and that actually looking and being attentive to men's engagement with religion and the way in which masculinities are understood through religion has proved really enriching and important. Now, I want to just kind of draw this together with some reflections on this kind of wider, the way in which we've been encouraged to think about our contributions to this conference, which has been fabulously stimulating and a wonderful opportunity. We've been generously invited to think about generations. And I personally, in some ways, have found this hard to think with. This is not to say that I don't feel enormously indebted to past generations. And I'd particularly like to mention Lee Davidoff's work that we've mentioned yesterday, and who, as you know, was meant to be here today and can't be. But she's, been a marvelous figure in my own work, inspirational, generous, and supportive. So there is that kind of sense of our indebtedness to generations. But I think, as Karen Hunt suggested yesterday, it's not clear that the British Academy necessarily is structured around those kind of generational divides. And this became very clear to me at the Berks conference last summer, where I'm sure some of you were there. There was this very controversial and interesting burlesque or boylesque show, the Down and Dirty show. And that show seemed to split the conference, or seemed to reopen sort of old wounds, really, around the kind of the sex wars in the 1980s, the sex positive, the anti-pornography camps within women's history. And in subsequent debates, I'm thinking of the special issue of the Journal of Women's History that discussed all of this. Some of the commentators did seem to want to use that language of generations. So one commented about the show: "The excitement in the room that night I interpreted as a younger generation of feminist women feeling that their feminist foremothers had finally acknowledged their adult sexuality. A collective version of a mother-daughter conversation where you finally say what it is that you've been doing and what it means to you and why you like it." Now, I think from a British perspective, that sense of generational divide didn't seem very evident to me. The sex wars, the culture wars were articulated in different ways, and were perhaps less significant in our trajectories. And there's been a lot of skepticism about whether we should think about feminist history in terms of first, second, third, whatever waves in the British Academy. And I found the show to be a brilliant, subversive depiction of gender queerness, which parodied all the conventions, if you like, of commercialized sex. But I do think that British women's history and the British Academy has had its own divides. So I want to just turn finally to some recent controversies over who it is that can write women's history that have been debated in Britain. So specifically, this is about the extent to which women's history is open to men. And of course, it's heartening that this conference has had many male participants and acknowledged the significance of the mentoring of men. There is, of course, a long history to men writing women's history, stretching way back beyond the 60s and 70s. But we've talked about many of those men yesterday, men like Keith Thomas, Angus MacLaren, Richard Evans. I was really pleased that David Duggan was mentioned. Again, this is about going beyond the academy and thinking about the presses or the libraries which support our scholarship. Now, of course, some of these men were prominent in women's history just because there weren't very many women in the academy in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But I think it's also part of a commitment to feminist goals on the part of men. I would say that in the kind of the moment that we've been asked to think about the 70s and the 80s, the large numbers of women coming into the academy kind of eclipsed those men. But they've come back in larger numbers as we've turned towards gender history. But their ability to write women's history has been problematized recently. The divide that has been conjured between so-called feminist and masculinist camps in women's history. And the suffrage historian June Purvis has been most prominent in shaping this debate, accusing men working in the field of being biased, of being unwilling to acknowledge women's scholarship. Byron Harrison may have been one of the figures in her sights, and he was a historian of women who controversially argued in 1983, and this is a direct response to the History Workshop Journal editorial that we discussed yesterday. He argued women's history is too important to be left to feminists. But Purvis was also specifically targeting Martin Pugh, who first published on women's suffrage in 1980 and has continued to do so into the 1990s and noughties. In 2002, Purvis claimed that Pugh was prurient. I'm not sure I can say that. It sounds like a great tongue twister. Pugh was prurient, and in particular that he focused too heavily on speculation about lesbian sexual orientation at the expense of acknowledging women's political contributions. She also claimed that he prioritized men's voices and the official record above the voices of women and consistently marginalized feminist scholarship. Now, Pugh's response to this was that he was being sexually discriminated against, and he objected to this debate as being a kind of feminist-inspired censorship. He concluded, "I would have to think carefully before publishing on women's history again." Now, there is a scholarship that's written by male historians which does seem distinctively anti-feminist. I'm thinking particularly of C.J. Behrman's controversial article on women's suffrage and militancy. Nonetheless, I do think that we need to think carefully about a degree of territoriality going on here. For me, there's absolutely no question that men have made and will continue to make really important contributions to women's history. We have large numbers of men enrolled on courses in women's history, and I don't think we've had to make a special outreach to get them onto our courses. They're there because these matters concern them and fascinate them. They recognize how compelling women's history and gender history is. But there still, in some institutional spaces, seems to be a lack of enthusiasm for their contributions, perhaps more so in Britain, where the problems of the academy have perhaps been starker, I don't know. But I also think the title of the Berks Conference, the Conference of Women Historians, still represents a kind of a space in which men may not feel comfortable. Of course they do attend, but not in very large numbers. So today I wanted to sort of acknowledge the wonderful, thriving, plural proliferation of women's and gender history, but also to think about our inclusivity as a counterbalance. Thank you.
So first off, I wanted to say thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. I feel I'm very much the starter on the panel and in the room. And it's a real privilege to have been invited, and also to have been able to speak to you all today and yesterday. So in this paper, I'll trace the influences behind my doctoral research, which I finished in 2012, and my current work. My thesis looked at the social history of single mothers in England between 1945 and 1990. It was based primarily on oral history interviews and contemporary sociological evidence. This paper will therefore put some emphasis on oral history, or the life history approach, not because I believe it to be preferable as a methodology, but because I think my coming to this method and its current resurgence amongst historians says something about my development and women's history at the present time. My thesis was attuned to generational change. It looked at 5 cohorts of women between the immediate post-war years and the late 20th century who had experienced widowhood, divorce, and unmarried motherhood. The oral histories on which the study was based exposed generational change and continuity, and interviewees frequently spoke of generational shifts when reflecting on their lives. I'm currently employed to manage an oral history of Warwick University, where again I'm confronting generational dynamics, interviewing students and staff who have passed through the university since its opening in 1965. However, when thinking about generational shifts, how generational shifts have impacted on my own research and development, I realised how little thought I've given to this, really. And getting into the day-to-day of research and getting a job, and considerations about inheritance and intellectual legacy seem to have been a bit passed over. And it seems that so much, in a sense, is haphazard with career. It's quite hard to construct something coherent in a sense of generations. I found myself asking, how far do I go back, and when did my interest in women's history begin? Although I began my PhD in 2007 and my undergraduate degree 10 years prior to this, I returned to the mutual interest I felt for history and English literature at secondary school. I read Alice Walker's The Colour Purple in my English class, despite the librarian initially refusing to hold it in the small comprehensive I attended. My English teacher's resolve to keep the book on the shelves alerted me then to the political force of writing, and it was her early influence that fostered my interest in women's history. I loved discovering also Anna Davin's Growing Up Poor in my history class, and in my mind these two texts did something very similar. They took me on a journey into an unfamiliar time and place and powerfully exposed injustices through the voices of historical actors. When I came to read English at university in the late 1990s, I wanted to sustain my dual interest in history and literature, but found that reading fiction in its historical context was out of fashion. We attended lectures and wrote essays on Kristeva, Derrida, and Lacan. Post-structuralist theory set the tone for interpretation, but I found the focus on the internal workings of the text, multiple discussions of signifiers and binaries, was taking me away from my appreciation of literature as a form of time travel, as a way of looking outwards and attending to the social. I took a course on women's writing to read George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and Jeanette Winterson, and another named The Male Bildungsroman, to read books such as Catcher in the Rye and Trainspotting. We got to talk about femininity, masculinity, the women's movements, and the politics of feminism. I knew that I felt at home, but I wanted to know much more about women's history. I read women's studies as a postgraduate at Oxford in 2002 and discovered it was part of the medieval and modern languages faculty, which I didn't quite anticipate. It said something about how it grew up. And there were just 14 students. I realised there was still something quite edgy about doing this course when the president of Trinity College, the college I was at, when he greeted us all, he didn't seem to want to shake my hand in comparison to everybody else's, and kind of said, "What is this women's studies?" So, and I still have the short guide to the course for 2002 to 2003, and looking through it whilst writing this paper, the outline of the first term's theory lectures took me back. There again were lectures on Lacan, Freud, Irigoyen, Foucault, and so this was a women's studies course which demonstrated the post-structuralist turn, like my first degree. I appreciated where post-structuralism came from, how this was a response to work of the 60s and 70s, which asked important questions about claims to historical truth, the overdetermination of structural theories, and the role of language. But what I was seeking were those histories written by women of the second wave women's movement as part of the new social history, which sought to retrieve the hidden from history books. I was yet to experience this movement to excavate women's past, and I wanted to answer the question, but what actually happened? I wasn't ready for experience to be passed over. Judith Volkowitz's City of Dreadful Delight demonstrated the pairing of social and cultural approach, and that there was a middle line which borrowed from both schools, and it also showed me how fiction could be part of historical analysis too. There was a lecture on materialist feminism and black feminism. There again was The Colour Purple, which I took to with enthusiasm for their attention to ethnicity and class structures of inequality inseparable from gender. I was particularly inspired by reading texts from a materialist perspective, Christine Delphi, Michelle Barrett's Women's Oppression Today, and Sylvia Wolby. Marxist feminism and its discussion of labour inside and outside the home offered me a conceptual framework which I came to for the first time, and it gave me words to understand the social and economic worlds of women in history as presented in many of the women's novels of 19th and 20th centuries I'd read in my first degree. After gaining my women's studies degree, I spent a few years working for a politician on issues of gender equality in Parliament, mainly women's pensions and girls' education in Africa. I was made redundant when the MP I worked for stood down because of the Iraq War. And I'd been thinking for some time anyway that I wanted to go back to do some research. And I did an MSc at that point in comparative social policy at Oxford in order to get into the PhD. I was attracted to studying a social science. And having found my encounter so far with women's history quite theory-heavy, I did want to get nearer what we call the empirical. So it was during the MSc and taking a gender and social policy option that I found the books and intellectual framework which guided me into my thesis. This option was rich in the history of women's lives in the 19th and 20th centuries, the development of welfare states, and women's part as both creators and receivers of welfare. I read Eleanor Rathbone and Margaret Llewellyn Davies' Maternity, Letters from Working Women. I use maternity now with my students to introduce them to the flesh and blood of history, to take them back to the conditions in which women found themselves bearing children in the early 20th century. These letters and lists, such as 3 children, 2 stillbirths, 2 miscarriages, speak for themselves, I think. And the scholars that I came to at this point, Jane Lewis, Susan Pedersen, Pat Thane, provided long views of women's history and the development of welfare. I spent some time looking at debates about maternalism, which hadn't featured at all on my women's studies degree. Pat Thane and Gisela Bock's Maternity and Gender Policies brought home the impact of a biological shift on women's history as a key change, the lowering of family size and women's reduced fertility. The authors claimed that this shift framed politics of the first and second wave women's movements. To quote, in the 1960s, a few feminists of the second wave took up the earlier heritage. As family size fell, childbearing was increasingly concentrated into a shorter period of early adulthood, and fewer women had children. Maternalist feminism seems to have lost its appeal. And so this struck me because I thought, well, perhaps it's explained why maternalist feminism hadn't really featured on my women's studies degree, and that between the first and second wave, a reproductive shift had taken place that had far-reaching impact, framing both material, social experience as well as political and intellectual outlook. Alongside these histories, I was reading the work of sociologists such as Rosemary Crompton, Ruth Lister, and Beverly Skeggs. Their research into class and gender and women's continued vulnerability to poverty alerted me to the importance of coupling contemporary sociological studies with a historical, longer view. And from this sociological literature, I learned about surveys and interviews, the gendered nature of the quantitative-qualitative debate, and from historians, I learned about archives and oral history. Ellen Ross's work on motherhood in the 19th century, Penny Summerfield's work on women in the Second World War, were books which demonstrated to me how women's history was diverse in its outlook and presenting both social and cultural analysis. I was enthused by the perspective also of Selina Todd's first book, which highlighted how oral histories, as part of a broader socioeconomic analysis, could draw out the agency of women as historical actors here in their capacity as wage earners. So in 2006, I put together a PhD proposal which would historicise single motherhood in post-war Britain. Discussion of the problem of single motherhood inside Parliament, where I worked, and in much of the sociological literature, seemed to be without a historical backdrop. And I wanted to get at this longer view to appreciate time, its changes and continuities, which is what I'd learned history could do. Linda Gordon's words, "There were always widows, absconding husbands, unmarried mothers," alerted me to the lie about the historical abnormality of single motherhood at the end of the 20th century, as has Pat Dane's insights since. So I embarked on a doctorate in history with the intention to integrate the cross-disciplinary education I'd so far received, which was actually outside of history. It would look at the history of single mothers after 1945, but from below, retaining the view that there was an experience of single motherhood which I could expose, however partially. From reading the existing literature, there were clear developments in state policy after the Second World War, the availability of national assistance, benefits to single mothers, the passing of the 1969 Divorce Act, the creation of one-parent benefit in 1976. But I wanted to explore biographical routes into single motherhood and the social and economic means by which women managed at the everyday level. And I also thought that oral history would be very good for drawing out changes in social relations and generational change around the single-parent family. And I also wanted to attend to the language and representations of single motherhood, and to do this by historicising the sociological studies of single parenthood that I've been reading. In thinking about the work that's surrounded me at this time doing my thesis, oral history and life history methods have had a renaissance. And the influence of post-structuralism has been integrated so that these are histories which, although seeking to retrieve and assert the legitimacy of experience, also look at cultural representations and language. And memory is approached more critically in oral history. The contradictions of experience and the contradictions within the transcript are embraced for adding to our understanding of the complexity of human history. A return to materialism and to thinking about Britain's class system recently, the attention to imperialism and structures of inequality are part of the picture, although I think that oral history, talking here also about oral history archives and collections, have some way to go in attending to ethnicity and the imperial term, including my own work. So attention to the subjective in current work through life history, oral history and biography is therefore being married with part of constructing bigger pictures about class relationships in post-war Britain, domestic service, women's reproductive and family lives, and also the second wave women's movement. There is a turn, also in the turn to subjectivity, more attention to emotions and the psyche. Lucy Delap's recent work on domestic service has added a new chapter to socioeconomic analysis by exposing how service has preoccupied imagination and had an emotional dimension and hold throughout the 20th century. Sally Alexander and Carolyn Steedman have, well before now, demonstrated how to blend social analysis with psychoanalysis, to look at women's historical subjectivities. But I do have some reservations about the use of psychoanalysis in women's history. I never understood the degree of space given to Lacan and Freud during my women's studies degree, and still feel that although there are human universals that cut across time, the problem with psychoanalytic interpretation is that Freud's theories and more recently Klein's have not been adequately historicized, and that there is a narrative about psychological development which is taken for granted as normative. In fact, I think it is questionable, particularly from a feminist perspective. The idea of the death instinct, the Oedipal stage, envy, as innate phases which have to be overcome, have meant that instinct is seen as divisive and even pathological, although this is being challenged in psychiatric and psychoanalytical circles. This template of human instinct and development crowds out what seems to me to be the more convincing idea that humans have a drive to social dependence, which was suggested by the campaigns of first wave maternalism or second wave Marxist feminism. in their exposure of the repressed story of women's labour in the taking care of others. In terms of what is yet to come, I think the period after the 1970s is important to turn attention to, not least because of the successive recessions and the economic context in which we're living today. The rise in married women's employment, the gendering of part-time work, greater levels of educational achievement amongst women, the second wave women's movement, increased numbers of divorced women and single mothers, greater access to formal credit, the gender dimensions of an ageing society. These are some of the aspects of post-1970s society which I think we need to integrate into analysis of women's recent history. I also find this an exciting time because of interdisciplinarity, the fact that gender is central to analysis in so many fields, it seems to me, and enables a rich collaboration. I'm particularly keen to work with sociologists, and my initial spur to study women's history after reading women's novels means that I'd like to bring more literary fiction into my research. Margaret Drabble articulates that there is a proximity between the two disciplines of literature and history, and one which I think the attention to life history and interview in recent women's histories has made ever narrower. So to quote Drabble, each character in fiction has an individual life replete with personal detail, the eating of meals, the flossing of teeth, the making of love, the birthing of children. But each also exists in a context, a fictional world comprised of geology, weather, economic forces, social classes, and so on. It is out of such individual particulars that fiction is constructed, and so too is autobiography, and so too is history. History may intend to provide us with grand patterns and overall schemes, but without its brick by brick, life by life, day by day foundation, it would collapse. My proposal for a postdoc project is to look at women's shopping after the 1950s up to the present day as an everyday activity, to demonstrate, contrary to the associations of shopping with pleasure and individualism and personal acquisition, that it is also a laboured, loving, social activity that has been an essential aspect of the maintenance of living standards within families and households. And I will try to give a long view, a historical picture, but to do so from looking to the brick by brick, life by life, day by day foundations of women's lives.
So I've been sitting here listening to these wonderful comments, and I've worked out that I'm the oldest person on this panel. But thank you to the organizers, to Susan, to Eileen, and Chris, who's right here. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a really wonderful group of scholars. And I think I have some of the same feelings that Seth has, which are, I can't believe all these people are here. This is so exciting. So let me talk a little bit about the imperial turn, in part, and the new imperial history, which was it was a pretty new thing when I did my PhD in the 1990s at Berkeley. Indeed, in May 1996, as I was preparing to go away to do my dissertation research, my advisor, Tom Metcalf, hosted a workshop at Berkeley to discuss this thing known as the new imperial history. It was a small workshop, and the idea really was to kind of think through how the old imperial history might be revised. And there were a number of names that will be familiar to you. Antoinette Burton was there, Madhavi Kale, Philippa Levine, and Mrinalini Sinha. And of course, what was interesting, of course, there were some men there, but it seemed pretty clear that whatever the new imperial history was going to be, it was going to have a very healthy dose of gender and women's history. At the time, Antoinette's book, Burdens of History, had just come out, emphasizing how British women activists had been complicit in building an empire, and it revisited Josephine Butler and some of the work that Judy Walkowitz had done. Mrinalini Sinha's 1996 book on colonial masculinity had also just come out, and it made us think very clearly about the British Empire's politics as being constituted by different representations about masculinity. I think Seth said I think Seth marked out the preface, which I think is a really wonderful preface. And of course, even though the subtitle was The Manly Englishman and the Effeminate Bengali, it was hard not to think about other imperial contexts in which you could map those on. I'm not going to speak very much about the second project, The Gentlemanly Terrorist, but I do work on the effeminate Bengali, in spite of all my efforts not to do that. And the only thing I will say is that Bengal is the one place that the British could have colonized where they would feel manly. So in some sense, colonial masculinity was a very particular kind of argument. Reflecting on that workshop now, 15 years ago, what's interesting is that none of the graduate students who were there were directly training in British history. So I discovered Ariane hadn't arrived, Priya Setia hadn't arrived. There were a number of graduate students, Lisa Trivedi, Rachel Sturman, me, Karina Johnson, who works on the Habsburgs, Kevin Grant, but that most of us were working on colonial history with some knowledge of British history. And I'll talk a little bit about what that meant. Anne Curie was also there, and she was working on a comparative project about indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest and in Australia and New South Wales. There were three main themes to the workshops, and I'll just go through them as a way of framing my remarks today. The first was that as we talked about the new imperial history, it seemed very obvious that the methods and paradigms and interventions of several decades of women and gender history would be absolutely central. So there was a lot of conversation about power, about representation, about authority, about knowledge. And in some sense, in response to the question that I think it was the question that circulated, I don't think actually that the imperial turn changed women and gender history at all. I think it was the other way around. I don't think the imperial turn would have happened without gender and women's history. It was a moment in which there had been a number of edited volumes that came out, Recasting Women, which was Essays in Indian Women's History. Came out in 1988 in India, 89. Western Women and Imperialism, which was edited by Margaret Strobel and Nupur Chaudhary, right? Ron Hyam's Empire and Sexuality. I don't want to drop that off our list. And then, of course, subsequently throughout the 1990s, Claire Midgley's Gender and Imperialism, really a wonderful volume. The New Imperial History, edited by Kathleen Wilson, and of course by Catherine Hall and Sonia Rose at Home with the Empire. And so it was very clear that there was a lot of, particularly in the edited volumes, there was a lot of range in how this field of gender and colonialism could be conceived. At the workshop in 1998, there was also a call for a more critical and reflexive approach to historical scholarship on nationalism, and in particular British nationalism. There was a strong sense that British history had maybe been a little too insular, and that the new imperial history was going to bring Britain's empire more centrally into the domain of what had been called, quote unquote, British history. Within the next few years, there was a huge number of books that took this on, from Linda Colley's Captives, David Canadyne's Ornamentalism, Catherine Hall's wonderful Civilizing Subjects, and I'm going to recommend the preface yet again, and then some unmentionable books about Anglo-globalization, which I'll put aside. One of the things that was very interesting at the time was that there was also a return to some of the debates that had happened in the 80s, a debate about the distinctions that already existed in British imperial history between a kind of empirical social and political history, a Thompsonian social history, if we want to call it that, which was seen to be firmly British, and a kind of tension with cultural history, which was somehow characterized at this workshop as being continental. And as a graduate student, I'm not sure I knew quite what that meant, but I think you have a sense of what the anxieties were within the old imperial history. For those of us who were graduate students in 1998, now I'll just focus on the South Asianists in particular, Rachel Sturman and Lisa Trivedi, and there's one other who I'll focus on at the end. It was a fairly exciting moment of possibility because we really felt ourselves to be at the intersection of this old area studies field that existed, which was South Asian studies, and this new field, which was British imperial history, because British imperial history was finally going to acknowledge the place of women. It was a fairly exciting moment of possibility, and partially because all three of us had gone through our educations between 1985 and 1995. And so we had all been undergraduates that had read Joan Scott when it first came out. And so that was for us a starting point. We'd read Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, which came out in 1985. We'd read Lata Mani's book on contentious traditions, the article that first came out also in 1986. And of course, we'd all read Chandra Mohanty in 1987. And so in some sense, I was really touched by yesterday's panel, in which for a lot of you that lived in that moment, you didn't experience it as something new, but actually at the end of a moment. For us, it was the beginning of a moment. And one of the things that I think we were all very concerned with was the idea of thinking about women's history, Indian women's history, and the question of agency. So that if colonialism, and I'll refer to Spivak's very famous phrase, white men rescuing brown women from brown men, there was a sense that there was a hierarchy and that Native women were on the bottom and they lacked agency, and that if they had agency, it was going to unturn the colonial dynamic or the colonial hierarchies that we had presumed. We learned to be suspicious of dominant paradigms emanating from Europe, and in particular, I have to confess, from British history. If British history was taking an imperial turn, South Asian historians were turning away from Britain. As we all revised our dissertations into books, the field of feminist South Asian history changed, as did actually very significantly our relationship to what I'll call the mothership. We have a lot of like family maritime metaphors going here. So we all, I think, had a kind of indebted relationship to British women and gender history, but a slightly fraught one, I think, in that moment. I'll just talk about my book as an example, which was mainly on European, mainly British men who entered into interracial relationships with Native women in early colonial India, so roughly from about 1760 to 1840. As Lawrence Cohen has said, it was very easy to use the word colonial in this context to explain a set of familial relationships that were largely patriarchal, they were unequal, and they often resulted in women being separated from their children as their children were classified as orphans. The policies of dispossession were supported by the bureaucracies of the East India Company, even though there were a lot of debates about just how powerful this company state was in this period. Was it absent-minded? Was it primarily considered a commercial enterprise? And what I argued was that in some sense, this company state cared a great deal about the familial arrangements of its employees and servants. These family state arrangements were characterized in the historiography as a kind of nascent and benign relationship, and I argued that it wasn't particularly benign, and that the expansion of the colonial government in this period occurred very noticeably on the backs of marginal populations, and I think a lot of us have talked about how important marginal populations have been to our work. But it occurred on the backs really of mixed race orphans and Native women. I presumed a lot about British history in the dissertation. I didn't know a lot of British history when I wrote the dissertation. In the year that I was revising the dissertation, I ended up at a fellowship at Amherst College and became very close to Margaret Hunt. And for those of you who know Margaret Hunt, she knows a lot. But what she said was very interesting. Of course, she's an expert on 18th century Britain, and she suggested that maybe British women were experiencing similar processes of dispossession to their property and maternal rights. And she recommended this wonderful book, which hasn't come up, Amy Erickson's book on inheritance and wills, which really began to change how I started to view the question of wills, family estates, and the customs, the familial customs that guided family inheritance in my own work. A year later, I met Susan Peterson. And I think since we've talked about institutionalization, I was a faculty wife at Harvard, and Susan took me in. And Susan asked me a question that, of course, became very, very critical to the dissertation, which was, I'm sure you don't remember this. You said, what were the rates of illegitimacy in England between 1750 and 1850? Because, of course, a lot of my argument was built on the fact that European men didn't marry the women that they slept with. And it turns out, of course, the rates of illegitimacy in England for the same class of men that end up in India is roughly the same. it was enormously transforming in terms of how the project, then I revised the project. I had already read Susan's book on the welfare state, actually, and Pat's as well, and that was an important component of the dissertation. And of course, as I worked out some of these empirical details in Britain and in India at the same time, it turned out, of course, that British women shared in much the same way a lot of the fate of the women that I was looking at. Along the way, I read Family Fortunes, which again, I mean, if you haven't read it, do read it again. And I read a book that hasn't come up, Lydia Murdoch's book about Victorian orphans, where I learned that, of course, orphans in Britain were orphans only if they'd lost their fathers, as they were in India. And that was another piece that had been very important in the dissertation and that I had to revise for the book. I had naively assumed that the dispossession of Native women's property rights and their right to raise their children was a product of colonial racism. And in some ways I was shaped, I think, by what Partha Chatterjee has called the rule of colonial difference, that the violence that happened in the empire was much worse, it was on a different scale. Native women, I believed, were doubly discriminated against because of race and class and gender. But what I learned, of course, in reading British women and gender history was that the colonial shared a great deal with the metropolitan, and that in some ways a more informed historical method as someone who worked on a colony was really to work out exactly what colonial constituted. And I think that that's something very important in terms of thinking about what happened in all those imperial historiographies as the imperial turn took shape. My book came out in 2006, the same year as Minnie Sinha's second book, The Spectres of Mother India, Lisa Trivedi's book called Clothing Gandhi's Nation in 2007, and Rachel Sturman's book last year in 2012. I'm not going to talk about Lisa Trivedi's first book, but it was part of a material turn, which drew very much from a historiography from France and Britain. And her next project, of course, is on women mill workers in Manchester and at Ahmedabad, two industrial textile towns. Let me just talk a little bit about Rachel Sturman's book, which is about law in India, and how it's produced a body of codes in which property and personhood have become inextricably linked through court cases that were adjudicated in Western India. What Sturman shows is that British legal codes and the thinkers who produced them, figures like Henry Maine, James Fitzjames Stephen, and others, formed a shared sense of the question of rights with Indian judges, such as N.C. Chandavarkar. And I know we were just talking about Raj Chandavarkar yesterday. This is Raj Chandavarkar's great uncle, and Raj Chandavarkar is important in a second. That one of the things that Rachel argues is that there is a kind of 19th century language about rights, about the subjectivity of women in joint families, about how to equitably divide family estates, and that in fact these debates were not anomalous to India, but that were based on principles of fairness and equity that emerged from Hindu law and British law. And so in some sense, Rachel's work, I think, rejects the idea of a rule of colonial difference. Rachel's book is a prequel to another book that will shortly appear by Eleanor Newbigin, and they both depart from this old presupposition that colonialism exacerbated metropolitan hierarchies and tensions. And what's interesting about Rachel Sturman's book and Eleanor Newbigin's book, just to touch on what Lucy said, is that they both take up intellectual history, which is something that was weirdly lacking in that workshop that I started with in 1996. So in 1996, we talked a little bit about the differences between social and cultural history. We never talked about political or intellectual history. And I don't know whether it was presumed or whether we didn't feel like we needed to articulate it. But of course, Rachel Sturman's book and Eleanor Newbigin's book are very much about ideas, about the spread of ideologies, the notion that there's a kind of shared experience of the idea of rights, of personhood, and of equity. For both of them, the gendered application of the law was not a colonial exception, but rather central to the paradoxes of modern liberal regimes across the world. I should say that Eleanor Newbigin was the last student that Raj Chandavarkar had. And of course, if you read him as a labor historian who believed that labor was one of these universal processes, you can see the remnants of that kind of idea behind Eleanor Newbigin's thinking. I could say a lot more about what I think are the new directions represented by Rachel and Eleanor's book. But let me maybe return to this question about the importance of intellectual history as central to the scholarship of gender and empire. And it may touch a little bit on what Ariane said about our turn toward the elites. If I had to identify a new direction, it would be this emergence between the intersection of political and intellectual history. And I don't think it's that it's a new thing. I think it's a return to an old thing. I think gender, feminism, these were always about politics. This was always about ideas. This was always about movements. And I think in some sense, it's a way of reclaiming those ideas as being ideas that made possibilities open to us all, even if in reality those ideas sometimes produce discriminatory practices. Sturman and Newbingen's book look on the surface a lot like high political history. They're about thinkers, legal tracts, government documents, legislative debates. But their concerns are very much grounded in global and transnational debates about social justice and economic distribution. I think this is very much because they are produced in the moment that they're produced in. Their books are very much about the gendering of the law, about female litigants and how women understood their rights, and neither makes the distinction between British and Indian law that was crucial to Chatterjee's arguments about the rules of colonial difference. In some sense, I think they speak to a sense of new confidence within colonial history that the colonized could lay claim to some of the central features of modernity, and in this case, rights, personhood, law, as powerfully as did the colonizers. In contrast to a generation of feminist scholars of South Asia before us, and I'm really thinking here of figures like Latamani and Chandra Mohanty, I think that scholars in my generation, I'm not going to speak for everybody, I think we no longer presume that Indian women were just automatically backward. But we see rather that they were made backward by some of the same processes that affected British women. So I think I'll end there.
Thank you. I think those were 4 really terrific papers, statements, very different, but with some sort of threads running through, partly having to do with subjectivity, literature, writing, religion, things that I think also mark perhaps the identity of this academic generation. So, now, is there anything any of you want to say about the others, or should we go right to the audience? Audience. Okay, so the only thing you have to remember is to speak into a microphone somewhere. Susan.
Hi, I thought that was just an absolutely fabulous session, and I learned so much from every single one of these papers. I guess I had a couple of questions, and one is for Durba. I think one thing that I think has been frustrating for people coming to international history, but not from diplomatic history, is the way international history has been engaged in a project of kind of I think of it as a way for diplomatic historians to try and claim a field and say they're modernizing, and it actually looks very old often. And this is one of the most exciting things about your talk, is it's a trajectory for the shaping of the field of international history that is completely different and recovers, shows how it is coming out of new imperial history, but also out of, as you said, out of that gender history, which is a kind of presupposition for that work and doesn't exist at all in that alternative trajectory of international history coming out of diplomatic history. And here I think, I just wanted to mention that I think one of the things that we forget is that Minnie Sinha did her degree with Bernard Semmel, and that's that and was also very influenced by Wasserstein, and you get that economic history and world systems theory and that sort of forgotten dependency theory, but already a very different way of thinking about relations in the world that is much more materialist than that was coming out of the colonial difference trajectory, and that has had such a shaping influence on this field. And so I think that's just, I just wanted to mention that. And I don't know if you want to comment on that trajectory in any way and on the problems the so-called, I mean, I just have an allergy to turns, and so I discovered, now I'm part of an international turn, which makes me want to flee. But, so there's, if you want to comment at all on international history. And for Lucy, I just wanted to ask you about this, I think it was very interesting, the stuff you said about the space for men within the writing of women's history. I just wanted to raise the issue of, because you also mentioned this, but with digital humanities, from a different direction, the way the publishing world is changing and how that is affecting women's history in particular. If you look back at some of those early works from the 1970s, what's amazing about them is not only that there was Virago as a publisher, but the Penguin and Harper and places like that were publishing women's history. So there was a commercial press that was also interested in women's history. Now, I think what's happening today is that there is a commercial press publishing in women's history in a way, but its influence is odd, right? What we're getting, for instance, Martin Pugh is publishing a lot. He's continuing to write a lot of stuff, including in women's history, but it's clearly, there's a marketization of that kind of work that's really, that I think is placing odd pressures on scholars, right? So I don't know if you want to comment on that at all. There's a disciplining of the market that seems to be happening as well from the publishing side.
I wonder if I can second that, because when I recently published, first of all, I published City of Dreadful Delight under, in America, as part of a Women in Culture and Society series at Chicago, and with Virago. And that series has closed in 2009.
Can you hear Judy? Can you hear Judy back there? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and Virago is no longer, and actually City of Dreadful Light is not available as a new book. It's only available as a used copy in Britain, but it's available as a new book in Germany and Japan because of this. Chicago kept it up. So I was very alert to the question personally of feminist book publishing. And I also had the experience of looking at the way the new book I just published was being indexed for cataloging purposes, and there was nothing on gender and sexuality. There are many other categories, and I raised it with Yale. And they said, well, we think you can probably, attract your usual constituency, but there are people who would find this off-putting. And I was shocked. And actually, I was really shocked. I was just completely taken aback at that open resistance to a book which I think is about gender and sexuality. So I just want to put that out. And I also want to say that I believe that Brian Harrison and Martin Pugh are two different categories of historians. So I would not put their situation together. And then I have one more thing to say about the Berkshire Conference, which I had a lot to do with in terms of its organization in the 1980s and early 90s, but not subsequently. And I think it's important to recognize that the reason why the Berkshire Conference exists at all, getting back to Mary's point, was that it was an old formation that was made new. And that's why the Modern Language Association doesn't have something like the Berkshire Conference. It's an old structure that was made new. But in my memories of the 1980s and 90s, I remember being on panels with Peter Bailey, Jim Epstein, Angus McLaren. I mean, there was quite a lot of, at least in my zone, effort to recruit men into the Berkshire Conference. And I don't know what's happened subsequently because I'm not involved in that. So that may be a generational difference on the American side, and I find it very interesting. These are big conferences. Everybody feels marginal. That's the whole story. When I went about 6 years ago, I was thinking, am I going to go to the Berkshire Conference in California? None of my New York friends are going. Nobody in my generation is going. And then I went, and I realized that I had other friends. And they were from New Zealand, and they were from Australia, and they were younger. And I forgot, and so it was a kind of a moment to reconfigure. And so this issue of feeling inside and outside when you go to a conference that has 3,000 people is just kind of a general experience, but it also may be generational too.
Does anybody want to respond here to any of this?
Can I just ask you a question about your experience? Can I ask you about your experience with Yale and the classification of your book? I mean, not for nothing, but it seems like your name is a brand name for gender and sexuality in British history. Like, I'm curious as to why they think that that's not obvious by the fact that your name is on the book, right? I mean, if you're an unknown like me, who cares, right?
Once you get indexed by the Library of Congress,
Yeah.
it's a little hard to kind of go
But
back.
I guess I just find it so dismaying. You've written a lot in this field.
I was this.
And I guess I think of
I
Judy
was a little
Wolkowitz as being
depressed about-
synonymous
I
with,
was taken aback.
you know, right? Yeah. You would think,
I was a little surprised about what they thought they were marketing.
right?
But I'm just I'm just saying. I'm just kind of
Yeah.
articulating that moment in which I realized that I was out of the publishing had the whole rationale of publishing had changed.
Right.
And it's only one press. It's a big press. So I can't say that would have happened elsewhere. But it did give me pause, and it also made me realize how out of control, how little control I had in terms of the presentation of oneself and one's book.
Right.
So I can't answer it. I think they made a big mistake. That's all.
It's bizarre.
Lucy?
Yeah, can I come back on that as well? It's a really interesting question, Susan, about publishing and the question of the series. My first book came out in Quentin Skinner's Ideas in Context series, which I was really pleased about because it was the first time they'd published anything that had any connection to women's history. And so in that sense, it was a kind of victory of sorts. But of course, it wasn't listed in Cambridge's history catalogue. And of course, they don't have a women's history or gender history kind of subfield. And that meant that it just got read as a kind of political thought text and therefore didn't reach very many historians. So I mean, I do think the series question is important. On popular publishing or trade publishing, I was chatting about this with Deborah Cohen last night, and of course her recent book is a fantastic example of how successful one can be in writing about women's history and getting your book onto all the kind of, into very premier sites in bookshops. So, I mean, I think in kind of popular publishing, there are some very sort of underwhelming contributions in women's history, but they sell really, really well. So, I mean, I think we should feel positive about that as a place where women's history is really thriving. It's not something I've done myself, so I can't comment any further. But one thing that I have been doing recently is some TV work. Now, some of that's been very, very satisfying, and the Servants series for BBC Two I thought was fantastic. Pam Cox was wonderful, and it was a model of what you can do that's exciting and interesting on TV. I've done some other things that have been much less satisfying. Sort of Downton Abbey writ large or writ historical, which I think is a sort of contradiction in terms. But the good news that we should take away from it is that there's really a lot of enthusiasm amongst audiences for women's history, and that's not really going away. Whether that's kind of been and gone or is resurgent or whatever it might be, I don't know, but it's certainly there at the moment, and that's one of the reasons why I feel confident that we are still attracting in students and larger publics.
There, in the back, yeah.
Hi, Selena Todd. One of the things that really struck me thinking about this panel compared to the first roundtable yesterday is that it felt like at yesterday's we heard quite a lot about reflections on networks that people felt that they were part of, whether within or outside the academy. And those seem to be specifically generational. And I was very struck by something you said, April, at the beginning of your talk, where you said, I almost haven't thought about my collective identity because I've been so taken up with the worry of getting a job and all of that. And I thought, yeah, you know, everyone in the room can probably relate to that, or they can relate it to their graduate students. But I wondered whether any of the four of you felt that you were consciously or actively part of any kind of women's or gender history network, or a network that allowed you to develop your work in that way. Because for me, this event feels like a great thing to be at, but partly because I don't feel like it's something that I'm going to very regularly at all. So I just wondered whether that was perhaps something that has changed for this generation.
Yes, I definitely do feel that I'm part of a network. I think I just didn't really appreciate or articulate at the time that those networks hadn't always been in place, if that makes sense. So when I arrived in London, I almost took for granted that there was a gender and enlightenment network that was international and that had seminar meetings and that people invited me into their homes or to tea at the IHR to talk about my work. I thought this is everybody's experience. And it was in fact quite special and particular to my time and place. But it's not a generational network, which maybe speaks to some of the points I was making in my paper. It was really men and women who shared a set of common academic interests that ran the gamut, you know, from dissertating students like me to very senior scholars. So,
I think I feel at Warwick, certainly since I started my PhD, that it's a place where there's been some very good networks. There's a feminist reading group that was set up in the last couple of years, and an oral history network. There's been a very good recent conference called The Problem of Work, and I think it's kind of generated certainly people coming together more to discuss kind of real life concerns alongside academic concerns in terms of women's lives. But I think that's really been something that's sprung out of my PhD. But prior to that, I didn't feel I was so much part of a kind of generational network, and I think the ones that are happening now at Warwick tend to be more based on my generation, really, more than cutting across generations. Yeah.
I think probably like Ariane, I'm not sure I thought I was part of a generation. Actually, we had this conversation this morning about the state of South Asian history, which is expanding, and there's a lot of jobs in South Asia. When I went on the job market, and I went on the job market several times for a variety of reasons, I never was on a short list with another male candidate. So if you can just run that in your head for a second, that meant that every time I interviewed for a job, the other people interviewing for jobs were women, and some of them work on women and gender history and some of them don't. So the profile of my field looked a certain way when I went through it, and of course now we're all just tenured or newly tenured, and training graduate students ourselves. And I think one of the things that we do talk about as a group is that we don't compete against each other, really, that we're thrilled that the field is doing really well. And I think we feel like we're part of a generation that has benefited from the expansion of our field, and I think we feel a real commitment to building from that. That was not true with the generation above us, who were all mostly men, and almost all of us were trained by men. And so, and I don't want to make a kind of gender-specific argument there, but I think it looks different. And I think some of it is that we all got jobs, right, because the field expanded. So I think that's one part of it. I do think, though, and this is something I have thought a lot about, I'm in a department that has two very strong senior women historians, Isabel Hull and Mary Beth Norton. And I think in my department there's a sense that those battles were won because they hired Mary Beth Norton and Isabel Hull, who are not to be trifled with in a dark alley. But what's interesting is, of course, these dynamics reproduce themselves with new languages and new means, and I think it's really important to be attentive to that. I also think, partially because I work on empire, I've been struck by the British imperial historiography, which there's a real battle, if some of you follow, there's a real battle between what's seen as empiricist and objective, and the word is objective is used, versus a kind of politicized, message. And I guess at some level, if you're talking about gender or colonialism, you're already political. And it's always been political. And so I don't think that there was a moment where we were without politics, even if we didn't have networks or solidarities. And I think this kind of gets back to what Ariane was suggesting, that I think our generation is seen as a generation without politics. I don't think that's true. I think we wouldn't have chosen this if we didn't have politics. We'd be investment bankers. We would have made our money in the dot-com boom, right? Or we'd be management consultants. So, I think we've come to our politics and our consciousness in a different way. But I don't think you can be in this profession without having a politics. So.
Well, there are two of you there. Why don't you first, and then Deborah.
I wanted to ask a question about Europe, partially because I'm supposed to write 500 words for the Journal of Women's History about European women's history, so I'm trying to figure out how much Britain places itself, British women's history, and European women's history. And there was just kind of a hint that, it's the continental, the theoretical, the psychoanalytic kind of came from that. So I was wondering if you all could say, so I can write it down, how much you feel or not part of European women's history, because part of making British women's history survive is getting out of Britain. I mean, British social history in general is very parochial. I mean, getting into Ireland can be difficult. And the British imperial turn has done great things for our teaching and for us intellectually, but also seeing ourselves as, is Europe relevant or not? That's my question.
Certainly, I would like it to be more than it is a presence in my work. And I was really aware when I was writing my first book about the transatlantic relationship and conversations that I could equally well be writing a book which was about Anglo-French interactions, Anglo-Austrian, American-Austrian. There was a much more complex story to be told, which I felt I didn't do justice to. It hasn't really been an intellectual presence for me. I kind of nod towards it. But perhaps one thing that might be worth saying in relation also to Selena's question about networks is that one of the great things that the wonderful network of the Social History Society has done is to encourage that conference to meet in locations outside of Britain. And that has helped cement some of those interactions and sort of make professional connections that has, to a limited extent, tied me into to Europe as a on my horizons.
I would just add to that, I think that we're at this curious moment in British history more generally, not just women's history, of re-engaging with Europe, which almost seems an odd claim, but I've been rereading Jonathan Perry's work on the politics of patriotism in the 19th century, and it's a strange book in that it seems that he's making this provocative claim that British people in the 19th century cared what Europeans thought about them, which I think we almost, with the imperial turn, it's almost like we forgot Europe for a little bit, and now I think that there's this re-engagement, and I see that happening within British women's history as well. Yeah.
I mean, yes, certainly. I'd like to think more about how I could reflect on European history. I think that, considering that my thesis was on single motherhood in England, so not even Britain, that speaks something to the fact that I was looking kind of for that depth that you get from oral histories, and it's quite difficult to consider how to do that and to make some claim to a bit of a general picture. And to do that, I think there is a tension between depth and breadth. And I think when it comes to oral history, like I suggested in my paper, I think that it does need to get better at, in terms of the field, attending to ethnicity and to kind of a more international scope. So I'd say yes, but it's as yet I haven't done that, and it's to develop. Yeah.
I think we're going to take 5 more minutes, so if we could move on, Deborah, and then there was Bonnie. Yeah.
Well, okay, I was actually wanting to ask about the local and the parochial in a way, rather than the international and the global, because one of the things that is not, I think, in any of these wonderful presentations is a relationship to history, as it were, as political practice, and the kind of move towards a citizen history, a people's history that was so evident in the women's history of the 1970s, in which people were doing lots of oral history, they were doing family history, they were rediscovering local kinds of activism, and that is partly a consequence of good things, which is the professionalization of history, the expansion of opportunities to do it instead of as a part-time hobby, as an amateur, but to do it as a professional and make it your whole life. But I wondered if there was any relationship for all of you between your own highly professional history, very theoretically well informed, with the kind of history done by amateurs that feeds into popular and public history in Britain particularly, but I'm not so aware of in the United States except through labor history.
I can take a stab at it. Maybe I'll just put the 2 projects that I've worked on that have no relationship to one another at all. So the first project was a project in which the women who I wanted to find out about had no history. They had no written history, so they never wrote anything from their own perspective except when they were petitioning or asking for something, right? So that's a very specific form of registering in the archives in a particular way. I'm working on this project on gentlemanly terrorists, and there is like so much by way of historical narrative. And in particularly, really interestingly, by the people that are hired to work in the intelligence bureaus, the British officials that are hired in the intelligence bureaus. The Criminal Intelligence Bureau is founded in 1901. And it turns out that all of the people that are hired are trained as historians at Cambridge and Oxford. And so, and if you read the intelligence report, it's very much like those undergraduate essays that Oxbridge undergraduates write, where you synthesize a massive amount of material, you create a narrative, you have an argument, and then you have a summary paragraph, right? I mean, this was training to be a colonial official, right? But what's interesting is that partially by the way of colonial documents and the way they work, these were stories that were retold and repeated over many generations, right? And all of these intelligence officials are all basically humanities students who've learned how to read and write, right? So, so in a very local and parochial sense, actually, and this is, maybe it gets back a little bit, these are not the insurgents, these are the people that are putting down the insurgency. But the history of it is very, very important to what they then argue, which is, we know they're trying to kill us. They may not be trying to kill us now, but we need something to put them down, right? Because we have a history now of 5 years, of 10 years, of 25 years, and so on. I think in an interesting way, that's a very important feature of what women's history brings, is that this was a history of a movement that was already being written before we knew how the movement was going to unfold, right? And this is probably very true for the 20th century. And I think in some sense that's a very astute question, because I think once you think about it that way, you can see it in different shapes, in different places, I think. I don't know if that's the kind of response you were looking for, but.
Bonnie, would you like the last word?
Well, it's not earth-shaking, but the panelists, unlike the panels we heard yesterday, not only didn't talk about networks, as Selena Todd mentioned, but there has been a slow whittling away of interest in any kind of theory. And April actually rejected theory outright, which I thought was amazing given yesterday's the tenor of yesterday's discussion. So I missed Ariane's, unfortunately, because of the subway, but is there anyone who could explain that to us?
Yeah, I didn't mean to entirely reject theory. I just felt that it was heavy. I felt that it was overly important in my women's studies degree, and I was looking more for narrative and I guess the empirical, but I wouldn't reject it. I think it's very important. And as you said, I mean, we come from a perspective when we write, and a politics, and theory is important in helping us think through that and to think in a more collaborative manner as well with others who are also trying to kind of paint theoretical pictures. I mean, it's a big question.
Part of it has to do with whether you come to theory yourself or whether you're educated in theory. I mean, that's what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing today and what I heard yesterday. But I also think what I gathered from this group is that there's a lot more interest in individual voices and statements, and maybe less emphasis on the kind of generalizing that theory sometimes either makes you do or helps you to do. But that's just...
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. People sometimes ask me, you know, what are your theories with a kind of capital T? And I think in some ways that my reading of the panel today is not that we've been sort of rejecting theory or avoiding theory, but maybe that we're at a phase where we're not looking for history, for theory to be somehow sort of external to history. You know, history, of course, does do empirical work. But I think it's been very productive of theories in its own right. So, I mean, I'm thinking about masculinities here. It's a realm of historiography, which is, yes, partly drawing on theories that have come from outside of history, and R.W. Connell, of course, is the one everyone acknowledges. But there's also, you know, I think the history of masculinities has really been theoretically productive. If you look at John Tosh's work, Michael Roper, these kinds of figures, you know, they're doing theory in their own right. So, I mean, I guess I wouldn't say that we've moved away from theory. It's perhaps we've integrated it more with our historical practice. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much.